Hey, we're going to talk about chemical bonds. So shown here are two molecules. We have methane, which is a gas, and glycine, which is a type of amino acid. So each one of these letters here is an atom. This is carbon and hydrogen. That's nitrogen, and that's oxygen. And the lines represent covalent bonds. That means that the two atoms are sharing electrons with each other. So I'll label that as a covalent bond. It's a pretty strong bond. Usually to break it, you need an enzyme. So the bonds in methane and in glycine are a little bit different from each other. So in methane, the electrons are shared evenly and equally between the carbon and the hydrogens. So this is called a nonpolar covalent bond. So again, nonpolar means that the electrons between the two atoms are shared equally. In glycine, however, there's nitrogen and oxygen. And nitrogen and oxygen pull electrons towards them away from carbons and hydrogens. So this means that they will be partially negative because the electrons are spending more time closer to the oxygen and to the nitrogen. And so we put a symbol here. It's a delta sign and a negative, which indicates that it's partially negative. It's not stealing the electron totally, so it's not completely like -1 charge, but it's partially negative. And the hydrogen then is partially positive because it has lost that electron, right? It doesn't have that electron around it as often as oxygen does. And same here with the nitrogen, so it's partially negative, and these hydrogens are partially positive. Okay, so these covalent bonds, because they're not sharing electrons evenly, are called polar covalent bonds. Okay, so like this bond right here is polar covalent. Okay, so I'm writing covalent bond because they are sharing electrons, but then it's polar because they don't share it equally. Okay, so because there are these partial positives and partial negatives, they can actually interact with other molecules that are also partially charged. Right? Opposite charges are attracted to each other. So I'm going to show you that over here with water. So this is a water molecule. It also has polar covalent bonds. The oxygen pulls the electrons towards it, away from the hydrogens. So they are partially positive. Okay, so if there is another water molecule around, let's draw another one here. Then the oxygen from this other water molecule can interact with the hydrogen from the first water molecule. Because, again, the oxygen is going to be partially negative. The partial positive and partial negative are attracted to each other. Opposite charges are attracted to each other. And so they interact and form what's known as a hydrogen bond. Okay, I'm going to draw it as this kind of dotted line. Okay, so this is a hydrogen bond. And sometimes they're referred to as H bonds, the H for hydrogen. Hydrogen bonds are actually not covalent, they're non-covalent. Okay, so this is a type of non-covalent bond because they aren't actually sharing electrons, right? The only thing that's holding these two molecules together is that one is a little positive and one is a little negative. So this is actually a pretty weak bond. Whenever we see interactions between molecules that are reversible and transient, it usually involves hydrogen bonds. Okay, so you can have hydrogen bonds between water molecules. You can also have hydrogen bonds with a water molecule and some other molecule. Like let's look at our glycine amino acid here. So we have, let's say, a partial positive here on that hydrogen. It could interact with a water molecule, right, which has a partial negative, right? So the positive on that hydrogen in glycine can form a hydrogen bond with the oxygen that's in water. And actually, if you have a very large molecule, like if you have a bunch of these amino acids attached together in a big protein, you can actually form hydrogen bonds between different amino acids in a single protein. So hydrogen bonds are found between like water molecules and other molecules, but also any sort of a polar molecule that has these polar covalent bonds can form hydrogen bonds. Okay, and that actually brings me to the next point, the next terms I want to talk about. So because glycine can interact well with water, it can like dissolve in water because it can form these hydrogen bonds, we say it, quote, likes water, so it's hydrophilic. Right? Hydro means water, and philic means to like. So any sort of a molecule that has a lot of these polar bonds is a polar molecule and can interact with water via hydrogen bonds and is therefore hydrophilic. Okay, it will be able to dissolve in water. What about our methane molecule here? So remember, it has all carbons and hydrogens, so all of these are non-polar bonds. So this molecule overall is non-polar. I'll write that down. So it's a non-polar molecule, right? As opposed to glycine, which has all of these polar bonds in it, is actually a polar molecule. Okay, so methane is non-polar. It's not going to interact well with water, and so we say it's hydrophobic. Phobic as in it doesn't like it, and then water, right? So non-polar molecules do not interact well with water. They cannot form hydrogen bonds with water, and so they're hydrophobic. An example of that would be like oil. If you mix oil and water, they're going to separate from each other, and that's because the oil has a lot of carbons and hydrogens, so it's non-polar. All of those fats in there, all those oil molecules are carbons and hydrogens. They're all non-polar, and so they don't interact with water, and so they separate from it. And so it's hydrophobic. Okay, and I want to introduce another term, yet another term, which is kind of looking at this from the perspective of fats. So, okay, a water molecule can interact with our amino acid, but the amino acid is not going to be able to interact well with fats, with oils, things like that. And we call nonpolar molecules, like fats and oils, we call them lipids. And so we can say that this molecule is also lipophobic. Right? Phobic, it doesn't interact well with lipids, and lipids are fats. Okay? As opposed to our nonpolar molecule over here, it will be able to interact with other nonpolar molecules, and so we say it's lipophilic. Okay, so these terms that I've drawn in orange here, they all describe the same molecule. It's just kind of taking a different perspective. So a molecule that has a lot of nonpolar bonds, nonpolar covalent bonds, we say overall it's nonpolar. It doesn't interact well with water, so if we're taking kind of a water perspective, then we say it's hydrophobic. But if we want to know how it's going to interact with other fats and other nonpolar molecules, then we say it's lipophilic. As opposed to our amino acid here, it is polar because many of these bonds are polar. There are a few that are nonpolar, like for example between that carbon and hydrogen, that is a nonpolar bond. But there's so many polar bonds in our amino acid that overall it acts as a polar molecule. It will be able to form hydrogen bonds with water, so it's hydrophilic. And it's not going to be able to interact with fats, so it's lipophobic. Okay, and this is actually pretty important for when we go over how molecules go across membranes and we talk about diffusion. So take the time now to really understand the difference between polar and nonpolar. Study some of the examples that we've gone over in class and in the modules, and make sure you really understand that before we move on to the next sections.